before we talk about hypnotherapy, I'm going to give you a bit of context. And you need to understand how our behavior gets formed. Because if we don't understand how our behavior gets formed, there is no understanding of what hypnotherapy is really about. So the key thing that we need to understand is the way we form our behavior is based on a particular event that happens to us. We experience something, and then at the moment we experience something, two things can really happen. It's either there is no emotional response to this event, or the very, very light emotional response, in which case it does not really stick, we don't really make any conclusion, or we have a strong emotional response to a particular event, to a particular situation. When we get a particularly strong emotion to an event, it creates automatically a kind of hardwire in the brain. The intensity of the emotional response that we experience creates the strength of this wire in our brain. And this is actually what we call the emotional learning. So we learn through a high level of emotion that we have experienced. So from this experience, we are going to make a certain number of thoughts. We are going to interpret. We are going to have a certain perception of this experience. From this experience, from these thoughts, from this perception, we create what we believe to be, at the time it happens, the most appropriate emotion. And when we have this emotion that happens, we create a self-defeating or a self-reinforcing conclusion. And from this self-defeating or self-reinforcing conclusion, we are going to develop a behavior that serves either the purpose of avoiding the situation to happen again, because the emotion was too bad for us, or create a behavior that helps to reproduce this experience because it was a good experience. And this is pretty much how we create our behavior. So the learning actually happens when we have this strong emotion. And when the emotion is very strong, it's stored in a particular part of the brain, in the limbic brain, the subcortical implicit memory circuits. And this part of the brain is exceptionally durable. So when we have a very strong emotion that happens to us, the memory, the data from this experience, and all the associations that we have made at the time are stored in a place through a circuit that is extremely, extremely, extremely durable. And the process of recalling this memory and all the associations that have been made, the general information about the event. What does this event look like? Okay, the big frame of what does the event look like? What is the emotion that this event is going to trigger? What are the conclusions that I've made about myself? What is the coping mechanism that I need to trigger right now to avoid finding myself in such a situation? Will happen without our conscious awareness. So what happens is what we call this emotional learning actually converts the past into expectation of the future. I want to repeat that again. The emotional learning converts the past into an expectation of the future. And all that happens without our conscious awareness. Okay, so when we have a particular behavior that we want to change, but we find it so hard to change, at conscious level because it seems coming back no matter what. It seems to reproduce itself. Or when we have mood swing that we cannot control, that seems to be happening beyond our control. When we get triggered in a particular situation and then we get overwhelmed by our emotion. When we have a particular thought pattern that we seem to be struggling with and that creates a certain number of self-sabotage behavior or even procrastination or simply a state of mind where we seem not to be really ourselves, where consciously we want to do something, but subconsciously it seems something is holding us back. When we struggle actually to change this situation, this fact with our willpower, most of the time, it comes from emotional learning. It's not always true because you can have some pathology or you can have a certain number of situations in which that's a chemical imbalance that create that. But in most cases, this is coming from an emotional learning. All right. So the problem with the emotional learning is when we experience something, when we experience a particular situation, we experience it with the age that we have, with the experience that we have, with the knowledge that we have, with the skill set that we have, and with the information that we have when this thing happens to us. But the brain takes it as a generalization of what is much likely going to happen if the same set of input reproduce themselves. So the brain, as you know, is a machine to generalize and is a machine to predict. So the brain is not going to be extremely granular in the analysis and the understanding of the context. It will be just the main information are there. So everything that looks like that is much likely to trigger the same response. Okay, for the brain, if you cross a road, much likely there could be a car on the road. If there is a road with a certain number of cars there, automatically your brain will tell you to be careful. Okay, so there is a generalization that happens right away. The problem with that, once again, is when we experience it, we have a very limited number of information. And imagine that that happens to you when you are 2 years old or 3 years old or 6 years old. The brain fixes at this very moment in time the behavior or the thought pattern that is deemed to be the most appropriate to survive this situation if it happens again. So I'm going to create a self-defeating conclusion about myself. For example, I'm not smart enough or I'm not strong enough. And then we are going to create a coping mechanism. The coping mechanism that the brain decides to implement at this moment could be, for example, I will shy away from people because in this very situation, I was exposing myself and then I got bullied. I'm not smart enough, or I'm not good enough, or I'm not lovable. So the best way to avoid being bullied is to shy away from people or not to talk in public or whatever. And then every time we will find ourselves in a situation where there are a group of people, for example, we might think that I might get bullied, and this process will take place. It happens with a very wide range of subtlety. It can go from an unresolved trauma that's going to trigger a certain number of chain reaction and behavior that are going to create anxiety or even depression or a lot of thoughts that we would like to avoid. But it could come as well in our everyday life. When, for example, we think that money is not good or I'm not good with money and we seem actually not to be able to make money or more subtle things like that. And the association were made actually from an early age. And as they repeat themselves, this connection is being reinforced. So what do we do actually with hypnotherapy? What hypnotherapy is really about, this is an investigation game. This is bypassing the critical filter between our conscious mind and our subconscious mind, using a state which is the hypnotic state, which is a state of trance, a state of altered consciousness, where we are both extremely conscious and we can access our subconscious mind at the same time. In other words, the body is kind of asleep, but the mind is extremely aware, and we can access both the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. So the game of hypnotherapy is really about going back in time and trying to understand what is the event and what is the emotion that was kind of like repressed at this time, that was not processed properly. What is the association that was made? The self-defeating conclusion that was made about ourselves? And what is the coping mechanism? What is the strategy that the 3 or the 4 years old, with the little experience that we had at this time, decided to put in place? And then trying to understand how this situation had kind of like reproduced itself over time, reinforcing this trait, to step by step evolve into the personality that we are today. And then today we are like, I don't understand why I'm being like that. I don't understand why I have this kind of thought pattern. I would like to change this habit, or I would like to change this behavior. And I don't know where it's coming from because it doesn't make any sense at logical level. It doesn't make any sense at conscious level. So this is what we do. First step is really going back in time, finding actually this data, finding this memory, trying to understand the very source of it. Once we get there, the thing that we need to do is pretty much showing the brain that the consequence, the strategy is actually wrong. The strategy is based on false facts. So we basically invalidate the learning from the brain. And the way we invalidate the learning from the brain is by asking the client, the conscious mind of the client, to experience the event from the past, the situation from the past, but dissociate himself or herself from this situation, because now you can look at it as the adult of today. You can look at it from a different angle, from a different perspective. Basically telling your brain that, oh, the learning was wrong. I am lovable. That was a particular event. It has nothing to do with me in particular. This is just what it is. I was just at the wrong place at the wrong time, for example. And the brain is lazy. The brain is not going to hold on information and process that are outdated. In fact, we constantly rewire ourselves. This is what we call the neuroplasticity. So the amazing thing with the brain is, as soon as the brain realizes that the program is outdated, the brain will eliminate this program. So you don't forget the memory, you don't forget the data, but the brain realizes that, okay, this is outdated, I don't need that anymore. We all have believed in Santa for a period of time. The second we stop believing in Santa, we don't have a second guess about it. It's done. We still remember Santa, but there is no more second guess about Santa. We realize this was outdated. So this is exactly how it works. And this synapse connection that was for a very long time thought to be unbreakable, what scientists have realized in the last few years is that when we use this process of going back to the memory, deconstructing the memory, showing the brain that the learning was wrong, that we can invalidate the learning, then it opens a window where we can, for a certain period of time, create a new learning, reconstruct the learning from the brain. And when we reconstruct the learning from the brain, then this new synapse connection happens, but it does not go on top of the old synapse connection. The old synapse connection is destroyed and replaced by a new one, which most of the time we don't need to go to the opposite. if we don't, it's not because we think we are unlovable, but now we can create a new connection that everyone loves us. But just by breaking the connection that I am unlovable, and we just look at that like, I'm just like everybody else, that's enough. I don't have my behavior of shying away from people or refusing to ask my boss for this pay rise that I really deserve, Pascal, stuff like that. So this is pretty much what we do when we work with hypnotherapy. So we update the learning, and it's a very fascinating subject because, as you can see, it's all about it's a detective work. It's really about working with a client, going back to the memory, understanding what is the underlying cause of our behavior or our emotion management or our mood swing or our trauma or our thought process, going back to the very root of it, and pretty much using actually the normal mechanism of the brain to eliminate what bothers you. So you can see hypnotherapy as a reboot of old learnings, emotional learning that doesn't serve us. Is that clear? Does that make sense? All right. Cool. Awesome.
One question, you need to have, in that case, pre-identified pretty well the challenge that you have. Because otherwise you could look in any direction. So how do you have a funnel to basically identify the sources of the challenge?
Okay, so you have different ways to look at it. One way is you can have a very clear memory of something, you understand that it has triggered you. It's very rare. Very rare. That happens only in trauma, in PTSD, for example. There is an unprocessed trauma, and when there is an unprocessed trauma, it actually it's stored. The elements are stored in a particular place of the brain. So that's a special case. In most cases, this is what you describe. You can come to me and say, for example, okay, in this sort of situation, this is how I respond, and I can actually feel this tension. I feel something is wrong. It's not the way I would be responding. Okay, and this is what we are going to do today with the meditation. We are going to work on emotional awareness, being aware of what's happening in our body, being aware to sense, detect these tensions that we have in the body. A problem, whether this is a behavior problem or an emotional problem or thought pattern problem, is only a problem because there is a friction between what you want to do at conscious level, your conscious desire, and what your subconscious mind tells you to do. And remember that your subconscious mind is a few thousand times more powerful than your conscious mind. So this tension is very strong. So you need to be able to detect that. So either you can give me a particular situation, a particular context in which this behavior, this thought pattern, this mood is triggered. Then usually what we do next is working on the physical signals. So by asking you to recall this situation, understanding, trying to live the experience again, just by thinking of it. And we have a very strong imagination. So we can, if I ask you to think about a particular situation, let's say in a tennis match, or when you are with your family skiing or something like that, you will be able to recall to access a certain memory, and most likely being able to reconnect with the physical sensation. We start actually from the physiological signs. And from the physiological signs, we use a certain number of techniques that help us to, I would say, peel down all the layers so we can go back to the root cause. And from this root cause, then we start working on it. So it's not a straightforward process. Like you tell me, for example, I don't have confidence, and I say, okay, let's go back for the first time in your life where you were not confident, because that's not like that. Confidence is the coping mechanism. So what we need to do is to work from the coping mechanism and going down to the emotional conclusion, the core conclusion that we made about ourselves. I'm not confident because maybe I believe that I'm not lovable, or I believe that I'm not good enough, or I'm not smart enough. Or maybe someone actually made fun a long time ago about my tone of voice. And I conclude that I'm not articulate enough, or I cannot speak to people, or my voice doesn't matter. Okay. So you need to come back to that. So we use a certain number of process and techniques, usually starting from the emotional response that you have when I ask you to recall about that. So we help you to be in a certain state where this emotion will be easily triggered, and then you peel it down from there. And you probably sometimes need a few sessions to be able to go back to the root cause, making sure this is the right thing. But it always works by subconscious associations. And most of the time you go back to the root cause, and then you recall a particular memory, or you go back to certain data, and then you can look at it from different angles, and everything changes.